On C-SPAN 3, we're live on Capitol Hill for a hearing of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations looking at U.S. aid to Egypt. We'll hear from a Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bush and an Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights from the Obama administration. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina will chair today's subcommittee hearing. The hearing happening after the visit of Egyptian President el-Sisi to the White House a couple of weeks ago, and also the call by the Trump administration for possibly altering the defense and non-defense investments in that region. Meanwhile, the Senate is in session this afternoon, gaveling back in at this hour. They will work on the nomination of Rod Rosenstein to be Deputy Attorney General. Vote on his nomination coming up at 5 Eastern. You can follow that over on C-SPAN 2. The House is also in this afternoon, gaveling in for legislative work at about 4:30 Eastern with the bill calling on TSA to improve security procedures for airport employees. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 3 of this subcommittee hearing looking at Egyptian aid to Egypt, and the chairman of the committee coming into the room, Senator Lindsey Graham.
Well, I didn't want to remind either one of us.
The hearing will come to order. We have a lot of our Democratic colleagues are in transit. We'll get started. Senator Leahy is going to be a little late, but as soon as he arrives, we'll let him speak. The hearing today is on United States assistance for Egypt. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Elliot Abrams, Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies, Council on Foreign Relations, has been in the government in a variety of roles back to the Reagan administration. Michelle Dunn, Director and Senior Fellow, Middle East Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Tom Malinowski, former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I'll go ahead and make a brief opening statements, and we'll hear from our witnesses. The reason I have this hearing is Egypt's important. It's important enough for us to care about the relationship, to try to make sure the relationship's going in the right direction. And it's imperative for me that Egypt become successful because it is such an important player in the region. We provide hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to the Egyptian government and the Egyptian people. I want to make sure it's a good investment. I want to understand what we're investing in. The one thing I would say about Egypt on the security front, they're doing things in Egypt that we haven't done in a while. They're helping with Hamas in a historic fashion. They're taking the fight to ISIL in the Sinai. But at the same time, civil society seems to be deteriorating. Their economy is lacking. And I really worry about a consolidation of power in a way that's basically undemocratic. I'm not asking Egypt to become America. I'm asking Egypt to become the best that Egypt can be. And millions of people went to the streets years ago to protest the Mubarak era. Some people gave their lives. Morsi was a result of that protest. Clear to me that he overplayed his hand. I want President el-Sisi to be successful. I appreciate his partnership on the security front. But for the American taxpayer, we need to highlight what we're investing in and try to use our money to bring about outcomes that will stabilize not only Egypt, but the region. It is a large country with a unique history, and I want nothing but success for the Egyptian people. And the purpose of this hearing today is to inform the Congress about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And unfortunately, it's all three. And we need to try to use our money in the most productive fashion to help Egypt, but it's now time for Egypt to help us when it comes to helping them. With that, we'll start with Ms. Dunn.
Chairman Graham, subcommittee members, thank you very much for this opportunity to address you. The problem for the United States in assisting Egypt is precisely this. How can the United States best support an important country and a longtime regional ally when its government adopts policies that promise chronic instability? the United States has an interest in supporting a stable Egypt, an Egypt that's at peace with its neighbors and also at peace with itself. But while President Sisi is fond of presenting Egypt as a bastion of stability in a troubled region, actually the country is struggling, and I'm afraid it could be headed for unrest within a few years. Now, to be fair, many of the problems in Egypt have roots that go back well before Sisi came to power. They've got a rapidly growing population. They have a history of indigenous extremist groups. They have an enormous and obstructionist bureaucracy. But there are also newer problems that Sisi has caused or exacerbated, which have made the country more violent, more polarized, and poorer than it was, either under former President Hosni Mubarak or even under President Mohamed Morsi. We're meeting today on what is a public holiday in Egypt, Sinai Liberation Day. And unfortunately, in the last few days, some very deeply troubling information has been coming out showing the likelihood of the Egyptian army carrying out extrajudicial killings of terrorist suspects in the Sinai. Perhaps, in fact, using assistance, using vehicles provided by the United States in this. And this highlights exactly the problem I'm talking about. Egypt does face a serious threat from terrorism, but the unprecedented human rights abuses and political repression practiced by the government since 2013 is fanning the flames rather than putting them out. And the United States, at this point, it does not really have a way to ensure that our assistance is not making the problem worse instead of better. I'm actually going to use my time to focus on the economic situation because I think that doesn't get enough attention. Because in general in the United States, President Sisi is getting good marks on his economic policies. And there is a positive side to what he's doing on the economy, but there's also a very serious problem. In the first few months of 2017, the misery index, which is the rate of annual inflation plus unemployment for Egyptians, has been about 45%. Core inflation has been between 30 and 33%. Unemployment, according to official statistics, is about 12.5%, and most experts think that is really an underrepresentation. For young people, unemployment averages about 30%. For young women, it is about 50%. So for young Egyptians, and those are the most likely ones to cause unrest, the misery index ranges from 60 to more than 80%. This is clearly an unlivable situation. And despite draconian anti-protest laws, there's been a significant increase in spontaneous protests related to economic grievances in the past year. Now, I said Sisi has gotten good marks on his economic policies, and that's because he's taken a couple of important steps on the fiscal side. He floated the Egyptian currency, which is the main reason for the very high inflation right now. That was something that needed to be done. And he's cut back energy subsidies partially and instituted a value-added tax. And he did these things in order to get an IMF loan, which he has gotten for $12 billion over 3 years. But there's another side in which Sisi's economic policies are really not helping Egypt with its economic problems at all. And that is when it comes to generating jobs, creating the conditions in the Egyptian economy for jobs. There are 94 million Egyptians. And right now, there are at least 600,000 new Egyptians coming onto the labor market every year. But the economy doesn't generate anywhere near enough jobs for them. And that number is only going to go up. Right now, there are 1 million new Egyptians every 6 months. So 2 million new a year. So you can see how the people coming into the labor force are going to be going up. And despite lip service from Sisi about creating jobs and so forth, it's simply not the case that his economic policies are aimed toward that. And they're also not aimed toward developing the labor force, which is a major issue in Egypt, that even the jobs that are being created sometimes go begging because Egyptians don't have the skills, especially if they come out of the public education system. They don't have the skills that are needed for those jobs. You know, unfortunately, look, a World Bank report in 2014 said it clearly. economic policies in Egypt are not focused on promoting the emergence of fast-growing, high-productivity private sector companies that would generate jobs. Instead, and I'm quoting here, they have worked to preserve insider privileges, leading to growth in sectors that are not labor-intensive. This is what's happening in Egypt. For a long time, economic policies have been skewed toward protecting the privileges of a few, the cronies of the regime. In the Sisi era, it's even fewer than that. It's really, the economic policies are for the benefit of Sisi's own constituency, the military itself. We're seeing a real change in laws, regulations, et cetera, that are allowing the military, rather than the private sector, to take up more and more economic activity. That's what's behind these mega construction projects that Sisi has been carrying out. The Suez Canal passage, the new administrative capital he's building in the desert, because this is how the Egyptian military knows how to make money, by building things. Let me just end with a few recommendations. I think the United States, with its assistance, should set an example of wise investment in human development, in education, and not to give budget support in the form of cash transfers and other things that will disappear quickly without any benefit. I would like to submit, Mr. Chair, some written testimony in which I have more recommendations for foreign military financing. But let me just say briefly, before the United States extends more, we really need to investigate these reports of human rights abuses and how the United States can take foreign military assistance to Egypt off autopilot and look at what we can really do to help and not to contribute to a worse situation in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to appear here today, and I hope I can insert the full statement for the record. There's a remarkable similarity between the structure of our aid to Egypt and the structure of the Egyptian military and its activities, and that is that both were really established decades ago, and both need to be rethought. I want to talk about the security sector today. Our aid to Egypt had not been very high and then leapt up after the Sadat visit to Jerusalem and the Camp David Accord, and that's 1978. That's 40 years ago. The Middle East has changed, and Egypt's role in the Middle East has changed in that period. The Egypt of that period was really the most influential country, most influential Arab country, and its position on everything was of significance to us. But that's no longer true. Egypt has no role of significance when it comes to the conflict in Yemen or in Iraq or in Syria, nor really on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself. Egypt's weight in the region has really declined. Now, we obviously want to achieve, as you said, Mr. Chairman, a stable Egypt, a democratic Egypt, an Egypt that can deal with the terrorist threat that it clearly does face, that can protect its borders. We want to help Egypt protect the human rights of all Egyptians. But I am always reminded of a conversation I had really decades ago with the late Tom Lantos, who was a great champion of human rights. And I was in the Bush administration at this point, about 10 years ago, and talking about aid to Egypt. And Tom Lantos said to me, let me ask you a question. Do you really think Egypt needs more tanks or more schools? And I think it is a question we continue to have to ask ourselves. Let's look at the Egyptian military. Our goals, probably the key goal in Egypt today on the security side, is to fight terrorism. But the Egyptian military remains a force designed to conduct conventional warfare, and indeed to conduct conventional warfare against Israel. That's what they exercise for. Another war with Israel. As an Israeli analyst put it last year, quote, the Egyptian military is essentially still modeled to refight the 1973 war, close quote. Stratfor put it this way: while the existential threat from conventional foreign militaries has waned in recent years, the new and unconventional dangers of insurgencies, terrorism, and non-state actors have risen, to take its place. Egypt's large and inflexible conventional forces, which are better suited to guard against foreign incursion, may not be as capable of addressing the country's current security problems. The Egyptian military is actually spending huge amounts of money enhancing their conventional capability. CRS reported that in February 2015, they purchased 24 Dassault Rafale multi-role fighters, a frigate, and missiles from France. That was a deal worth nearly $6 billion. 2014, they bought 4 naval corvettes from France. That was $1.35 billion. Fall of 2015, 2 Mistral helicopter carriers from France. Large purchases from Russia. How do purchases like an anti-ballistic missile system from Russia and advanced combat jets really combat terrorist groups like ISIS? How do submarines? Yet Egypt just last week received the first of 4 German-made attack submarines, total cost 1.4 billion euros. There are other problems with the arms aid to Egypt. GAO published a report last March entitled, U.S. government should strengthen end-use monitoring and human rights vetting for Egypt. They're not doing all the vetting that they should be doing. Now, turn to the approach to terrorism. It's just not succeeding. The tactics of the Egyptian government appear to be failing. Just as the terrorist attacks have become routine, so too have heavy-handed Egyptian responses, resulting in civilian casualties. Michelle Dunn mentioned this video that just surfaced. An analysis by the Carnegie Endowment recently concluded state-sanctioned violence against civilians has only increased local anger against the military. That's in Sinai. Egyptian policy has, quote, shifted some sympathy from the military to the militants, who are increasingly seen as a way to take revenge. That's Sinai. I think actually that the Egyptian handling of this is creating jihadis. I mean, if you take 60,000 political prisoners, and that's the number that there are in Egypt, people who have not committed acts of violence, beat them up, toss them into prison, keep them there for years, incarcerate them with real jihadis, and what comes out at the end of that process is more jihadis. And that is what's happening in Egyptian prisons. A recent New York Times article about prisoners in Egypt interviewed a man named Ayman who said, many of the prisoners he met were from the Muslim Brotherhood. The group formally renounced violence in the early 70s, but Ayman watched his cellmates grow hardened in prison. The torture and unjust imprisonment for long periods without clear charges or trial dates created human bombs. NPR recently had a story about a journalist who was jailed, Hossam El-Din, who said, in jail they become ISIS. This is a common story. It is the story that produced Ayman al-Zawahiri of al-Qaeda, who was radicalized in an Egyptian prison. So I think it is time, Mr. Chairman, to review the tactics of the Egyptian military against terrorism and to review the nature of our aid so that it is targeted toward fighting terrorism and not toward sustaining this conventional military that really has no significant use today. Thank you.
Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Senator Graham, members of the committee. Let me, I want to start by echoing a point that Elliot Abrams made, because I think the overarching question here is what are our interests? What are our expectations with respect to our relationship with Egypt, and what do we actually get for this investment? The aid program, the relationship, it's been based on a longstanding assumption that Egypt is an important player in the region, and with that assumption comes another, that our long-term interest in better governance, respect for human rights, sometimes comes into conflict with our immediate national security interests. We certainly in the Obama administration operated on the assumption that there was a lot that Egypt could do for regional security and for us. And we tried again and again and again to engage them on a variety of common interests. And I would say the reality is we were frustrated in the vast majority of cases. More and more, it looked to us that Egypt is becoming a country that sucks up aid, a lot more from the Gulf states than from us, as you know, while contributing very, very little to regional security and treating the aid as an entitlement that simply must continue and continue and continue. About the only country, well, there's the longstanding Egyptian commitment not to tear up the treaty with Israel. I guess that's one thing that we get. At this point in the history of the Israeli-Egyptian relationship, I would say that that is something that sustains itself because it's very much in Egypt's interest. It's not something that they do for us. In Libya, their influence has been largely negative. After receiving $70 billion of American assistance over the years, I'm sure you've noticed that there's not a single Egyptian F-16s in the skies over Raqqa or Mosul helping us in the counter-ISIL fight. Yes, they are engaged with ISIL in the Sinai, but as we've heard, in ways that probably make the problem steadily worse rather than better. And this video that has already been mentioned a couple of times, I think, in addition to showing something gruesome, also shows just how counterproductive the tactics are. This is basically a window into a strategy in which young men who may or even may not be members of ISIS are rounded up, executed in cold blood, and then passed off as casualties in a battlefield fight so that the army can look good. We know from history that is the way to lose a fight like this, not to win. I think almost any observer of the Sisi government, I think, would agree that over the last 2 or 3 years, the primary priority of the Egyptian military and of General Sisi has not been to fight terrorism or to improve governance. It has been to make sure that what happened in 2011, the Tahrir Square rising, something like that can never, ever, ever, ever happen again in Egypt, and that the power of the military over the country's politics and economics is not challenged again. And as a result, they have concentrated as much on persecuting their political opponents, peaceful protesters, independent NGOs, the very people in the country who are most likely to despise jihadism, as it has on hunting down terrorists. So we know some of the leading dissidents in the country from the 2011 period are still in jail, tens of thousands of others behind bars for nothing more than having attended a demonstration or being members of a political party. A lot of these folks languish for years in pretrial detention, like the American citizen Aya Hijazi did. Many are subjected to the most brutal forms of torture. Read, if you have the stomach for it, the coroner's report on the death of that young Italian student, Giulio Regeni, who was disappeared in Cairo last year. And you'll have a sense of the sadistic treatment that Egyptians experience at the hands of their security agencies. The top officials of those agencies know perfectly well what goes on, and they do nothing to stop it. In fact, one of the most notorious places of torture in Egypt is the headquarters of the National Security Agency, the successor to the old secret police, right in downtown Cairo near Tahrir Square. Meanwhile, crackdown on NGOs has intensified. The new NGO law basically makes it illegal for civil society organizations to function unless they get permission for every single thing they do from the government. We've had a steady presence of preposterous, ridiculous, and pernicious anti-American propaganda in the state media. So the same government that comes up here and lobbies for less restrictions on assistance in the name of better relations with Egypt, back home in Egypt, treats anybody who seeks to get support and partnership from the United States as a criminal. What should we do in light of all these problems? Well, I think we have to have realistic expectations. Egypt has been experiencing this turmoil for a long time. Only Egyptians can resolve this. It's probably going to take a lot longer for that to happen. I don't think more positive engagement is going to work very well, nor do I think that more quid pro quo slap on the wrist conditionality is going to work all that well in terms of changing things fundamentally. But though it may be hard to change the way the Egyptian government treats its own people, one recommendation I'd have is that we should demand that it change the way it treats ours. We should have zero tolerance for the mistreatment of American citizens, for continued anti-American propaganda and state media, and for the persecution of individuals or NGOs for association with Americans. I'll say this half tongue-in-cheek. You can call this an America First human rights policy for Egypt. These are things we can demand, and they will respect it if we demand them. Number two, avoid complicity in these abuses. So enforce the Leahy law when there are serious violations. Be very, very wary. I would encourage you all of any proposals to try to strengthen, intensify, deepen counterterrorism and intelligence sharing partnerships with the security agencies that are engaged in these abuses. They will abuse the partnerships in addition to the people. Third, avoid reinforcing the Egyptian sense that aid is an entitlement. So cash flow financing of military aid, we should not go back to that. And then the big question is, what do we do about military assistance? What do we do about the $1.3 billion in FMF? I think it would be a dispiriting choice to simply go back to providing that unconditionally. It would just be helping Egypt buy weapons that are ill-suited to meet the threats that it faces, while reinforcing that entitlement mentality and kicking the serious problems down the road again. Another possibility would be to provide most of it, continue withholding the 15% currently withheld because of human rights abuses. That would send a modest signal of disapproval. Not sure if it would do all that much good. The third option would be to step back and ask whether our investment in Egypt is appropriate given the value we get from it and the crises and opportunities we face elsewhere. My strong view is that the investment is completely out of balance. Does it really make sense for this government, which does so little for regional security, which consistently rejects our advice, which describes us to its people as a hostile enemy, to receive such a disproportionate share of U.S. military aid? So I agree we should tailor what we provide to actual counterinsurgency operations in places like the Sinai, if they're willing to accept it, which I'm not sure if they would under those terms, and think about where else in the region and the world our partnerships are appreciated and our money can do actual good in the fight against terrorism and for a better world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We'll do 7-minute rounds, and I'll start off. Mr. Abrams, I've talked to Israel recently. They are fairly pleased with the security cooperation between Egypt and Israel regarding Hamas. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. The government of Egypt, of course, views Hamas as part of the Brotherhood, very much opposed to it, and there's probably better cooperation against Hamas than there's ever been. I think it's fair to say the Israelis are more active now in helping in Sinai than they have ever been before.
I hear reports where Egyptian helicopters are flying from Israeli air bases to confront ISIS.
I've heard those reports.
Yeah. Okay, so on the good side, it seems like we have a relationship between Egypt and Israel on the security front that is productive. Tom, tell us about the NGO law very briefly, if you could. What are the requirements of this new law they passed?
Well, they've gotten tighter and tighter, but basically a whole range of day-to-day activities that an organization needs to conduct.
Well, I've heard that you have to get approval from the government for a survey, a poll survey.
Sure, or any number of other activities. So, first of all, those requirements give the government the opportunity to say no and to shut down particular activities. But even if the government is not so inclined, the mere fact that you have to constantly ask for permission to do things is just, it makes it virtually impossible to function. And it's almost impossible not to, the rules are so complicated, it's impossible not to be in violation of something at any given moment, which means that at any given moment, if the government wants to shut you down, it can. An example of this, the leading organization in Egypt for the rehabilitation of torture victims was recently shut down. So,
okay. It's also true that American NGOs, IRI and NDI, that members of Americans have been convicted in Egyptian court, basically of being spies. Is that true, Mr. Abrams?
It is true. And it's an extraordinary thing.
Ray LaHood's son.
Ray LaHood's son is one of them. It's an extraordinary thing. We're talking about Freedom House, IRI, NDI. These are not subversive organizations.
Right. So I've talked extensively with President El-Sisi about this. I want to appreciate what the Egyptian government did with Aya Hijazi. Clearly, I think there were trumped-up charges. She was acquitted within a few days of a visit, so much for we can't control what happens in the judiciary. Ms. Dunn, in terms of the future of Egypt, without some economic reforms and without economic growth, what's going to happen in Egypt? And to all of you, very quickly, what does it matter to us if Egypt becomes a failed state? Because that's what I fear the most, quite frankly, is that we're headed that way.
Yes, Senator, that's true. That danger is there. The employment problem in Egypt is enormous. The human development problem in Egypt is enormous. They have failing educational institutions, people coming out of secondary school and even public universities without the basic skills needed to be in the global workforce. So those are major problems. And as I've said, the Egyptian government persistently makes economic decisions that don't really empower the private sector, small and medium enterprises, et cetera, to create jobs. That's what's really needed to create, labor-intensive industries, services, et cetera, to put Egyptians to work. Without that, you've got a growing unemployment rate and you have a growing population. The growing population, I think, is also related to the fact that young women can't get jobs. And so sometimes they marry very early and start families, have big families. So it's hard to see where this is going. And what the government keeps doing, and I think Tom Malinowski referred to this, is just trying to attract more and more external financing to keep them afloat. But that's not a long-term plan. They need a productive economy.
Elliot.
But it is by far the most populous Arab state with over 90 million people and growing fast. So if it were to become a failed state, as you said, Mr. Chairman, the impact on the whole Arab world would be destabilizing. It would be destabilizing in North Africa. And if you ever got refugee flows, it would make the refugee situation in the region and toward Europe that much worse.
How realistic is that? Is that a possibility?
Well, I think it is a possibility that you would see more disorder because, for one thing, as Dr. Dunn says, the economic conditions are deteriorating. You have more strikes. You could see more bread riots. So you could see a deterioration which could, it's a vicious cycle. That produces more repression, which then produces more of an uprising. So I think it is we should not assume stability in Egypt.
That's my question. We assume it just because it's been there, but I don't think that's a good assumption to make given what I know. Tom, do you agree with that?
Sure. I don't think Egypt has been stable for the last 6 years, since 2011. I think it would be foolish for me to make predictions about when the next political rising will be. We have no idea. But we do know that this is a country that will demonstrate surface stability until it doesn't. And because of its size, because of its volatility, the consequences could be quite great.
Thank you all. I recognize Senator Leahy now, then we'll go to Senator Moran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for being late. We've been in a lot of negotiations on getting the appropriations bill through. I'm glad to see the panel you have. I know all three of them, and I think the committee is fortunate to have the views of them. I look at Egypt, an important country, at least in their mind. The question is, where is it going? Yes. Now coming from mine.
Being cyber attacked by somebody.
Let me try a different microphone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. In my lifetime, we've provided more than $79 billion in economic and military aid to Egypt. That doesn't include the excess defense equipment that runs into billions more. Certainly the Egyptian people seem generally unaware of that. That's why the U.S. comes across so negatively in most of their polls. Or maybe they do know it and they resent how the aid has been used. It's propped up a lot of repressive actions on their own government. And the younger generation sees no prospects for jobs. Now, their position geographically does give importance. I don't know if it gives enough importance for the billions of dollars we spend there. And they have thousands of members of political opposition teams groups get imprisoned after sham trials. When members of civil society organizations are accused of salacious crimes, they're detained for years. When critics of the government are tortured and killed, when U.S. officials and independent press are denied access to areas where U.S. weapons are being used amid reports of war crimes, I think we have to ask some basic questions. Now, Secretary Malinowski, you've heard me ask these questions before, but what do the Egyptians plan to do with civil society groups? If they use anti-terrorism laws to arrest these people, I mean, how should we react? Are there conditions that would have effective steps on our aid? What is our $1.3 billion in annual military aid serve? What security threats do they face that justify this? And even if they have it, how's it being spent? Or is it just, oh, we agreed to this back at Camp David, it goes by just the momentum of that? And, I want Egypt to succeed, but certainly not in a way where everybody is being repressed, where give us the money, give us the aid, give us the equipment. We're not going to tell you how we're going to use it. Now, Mr. Malinowski, you were Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, and I want you to know an awful lot of members in the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, applaud what you did.
Thank you.
I'm sure you had a lot of meetings with the Egyptian authorities on human rights concerns. How did they respond? Was there anything useful? I mean, I've been in meetings with you. I've heard you ask some pretty good questions, but did you get pretty good answers? Go ahead.
Well, my job was talking to authoritarian governments around the world. And I have to say the meetings with the government of Egypt were amongst the least productive and most unpleasant in my time at the State Department. There are a lot of governments around the world that do things we don't like, but you can have a thoughtful, intelligent conversation, intellectually challenging, where you're talking to somebody who you feel like they've got the best interest of their country in mind, but they have a different vision for how to achieve them. And in the case of Egypt, it's just angry, rude denial of all problems. And how dare you, U.S. government official, raise these things with us, and where's our money? Thank you very much. Goodbye.
That's to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. I don't have to be as diplomatic anymore as I used to be. And this is why I've come to the conclusion that, probably more endless hours of attempted persuasion are not going to get us very far. That what we need with the government of Egypt is a stepping back, a bit of a timeout, where we get out of this entitlement mentality where they think that every part of the relationship is something that we owe them. And we step back and try to design a relationship and an aid program that actually is there to do something positive, rather than just an aid program that we provide because of what we fear they will do if we somehow cut them off. And
What happens when I raise some criticism with them? They say, "Well, look how hard we're working on ISIL in Iraq, Syria, Yemen." Are they?
Well, certainly not in Syria, certainly not in Yemen. They are fighting ISIL in the Sinai, but as we were discussing, in a manner that's probably making the problem worse, not better. They face a very, very real, genuine, serious security threat. Their soldiers, their police are getting blown up. There are attacks in Cairo and other Egyptian cities. I'd like to be able to help them with that threat. I would help any country facing that threat. But what they have been absolutely resistant to doing is taking the advice that our military and our national security professionals have tried to offer with the equipment, with the training that our aid pays for. And so you see these very ham-handed tactics that again make the problem worse.
Mr. Chairman, my time's up. But Dr. Dunn and Mr. Abrams, I have some questions I'll submit for the record. The staff gave me a summary of everything you've already said, and I was, both of you, not only impressed, as I fully expected I'd be, but I'm very appreciative of it from both of you. And I will, Mr. Chairman, add some other questions.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'll try to do 2 or 3 quick questions. What's the consequence to an alteration of the aid we provide Egypt in the relationship between Egypt and Israel? The historic connection there exists. Would you expect any consequences today if we alter the aid that we provide Egypt?
Well, I would not, Senator. We saw even during the Morsi period, when there was some fear that he would completely change the relations with Israel, he didn't really touch that. Good relations with Israel are in the interests of Egypt. The army understands that. They're getting help, as Senator Graham was mentioning, they're getting help in the Sinai. So I think the answer is no impact.
Okay. Anyone disagree? Yes, Ms. Dunn.
Well, I don't disagree, but I would like to add something, Senator. Look, I think that, there's a good and bad side to the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. The good side is the military-to-military and security-to-security cooperation. The not-so-good side is the civilian side of it and the people-to-people side, which is very weak and very cold. And but I agree with Mr. Abrams that the aid that the U.S. provides no longer drives this. And I would point out that there was a period during the Obama administration, shortly after the military coup of 2013, in which much of the military assistance was suspended for more than a year. I mean, that was the heyday of Egyptian-Israeli relations. So I think that really proved the point that the relationship now has its own logic, its own dynamic.
Thank you. I was looking for that kind of reassurance. Mr. Malowski, you indicated about what's occurring in regard to NGOs, and Senator Graham followed up a bit on that. What's the rationale? What benefits the Egyptian government in restricting NGO activity? Why is that a benefit to them?
Well, parts of it are more logical a nasty way than others. Certainly, if there's an NGO that is working on anti-torture and your police and security forces are engaged in torture, then you may not want that NGO running around and making its reports. NGOs that work on press freedom, on human rights issues, on any matter, or anti-corruption, very important, any matter on which the government is likely to be exposed for doing bad things, then it's natural that an authoritarian state like this would want to bring those kinds of NGOs under control. What is interesting and perhaps a bit less obviously rational is that this crackdown has encompassed not just organizations working on what you might think are politically sensitive issues, like the ones I mentioned, but virtually all NGOs that operate independently from the state. One of the problems we had last year in our ESF program was we had an NGO called RTI, which is one of the big sort of USAID implementers that was working on education programs in Egypt, totally innocuous, non-political, and that organization became subject to a massive campaign of public vilification in the Egyptian state media. They're corrupting our youth, they're spreading homosexuality, they're doing this and that, all part of this larger campaign against foreign and particularly American funding of NGOs. So the government uses this kind of nationalism, this anti-Americanism, to vilify NGOs of all stripes. And in that case, it resulted in, well, first Secretary Kerry pleading with General Sisi, please take our aid, do us the favor of taking our money. And in the end, they wouldn't do it. Or, they were willing to take it if we just wrote them a check, but they didn't want us to do it through an independent NGO. And one of the best decisions we made was to say, all right, to heck with it, we're going to spend that money in Tunisia, in Iraq, in Syria, in places where we have equally pressing interests, but partners who want to work with us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Abrams, you mentioned that Egypt is purchasing Russian military equipment. Russian special forces have been dispatched to the western desert in Egypt. Since intervening in Syria, there's been a lot of concern about Russia asserting itself in the Middle East. In changing how we provide aid, are we giving Russians an opportunity for more influence in Egypt and in the region as a whole? What's the consequences to Russia and its influence based upon decisions we might make?
I think one would have to say that there would be something of an opening for the Russians. They, unlike the Gulf states, which are giving tens of billions of dollars, or the United States, we give about $1.5 billion a year. The Russians are not going to give them that kind of money, but they would be willing to make loans and sell arms equipment, and they'd throw their weight around in Cairo if they see a weakening of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. Thing is, they can't really replace us in terms of economic aid, in terms of military aid, in terms of technical assistance. But I think we would have to acknowledge that you might see a kind of resentful government of Egypt talking to the Russians more. They are doing, for the first time in history, they are doing now a military exercise with the Russians in the western desert. And they're doing that already while the aid hasn't been cut back a cent. You might see more of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, both you and Senator Leahy, and to all of our witnesses for your testimony. Just to follow up a little bit on Senator Moran's question, might we expect that Sisi would go back to the days of Nasser, where Egypt played off Russia against the United States in terms of future assistance? Mr. Abrams?
I think you'd see him threatening to do that. I think you'd see that in the state press. It's hard for them. I mean, the whole military now, after all these decades, is really equipped with American stuff. Now they're starting to diversify with these more recent purchases. But I think you'd certainly hear, if you will, threats of doing that. And the Russians would love to take advantage of this, as we've seen in Syria. They'd like to reassert themselves. For Putin, this would be a dream come true. So I don't, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a danger of the Egyptians moving in that direction.
Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Malinowski?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mr. Abrams, and they will if we let them, in a way. I mean, it's an old game, right? And we remember that game in the Cold War, where all kinds of authoritarian countries in the developing world would play us off against the Soviet Union. If you're not nice to us, we'll go to Moscow or we'll go to Beijing. And I hope we don't allow ourselves. This is a much bigger question than just Egypt. In this era of unfortunate great power, resumed great power competition, I hope we don't allow our decisions to be influenced too often by that kind of calculus, because all we would be doing is empowering people like Sisi to get what they want by, making that trip to Moscow and being pictured with Putin and then scaring us into giving him more. I don't think that's in our interest.
Thank you. Dr. Dunn, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I just wanted to add that I think this is already happening in effect, and I think it will happen even if we continue providing the military aid at the full level. That clearly President Sisi admires Putin a great deal, approves. He said openly from the beginning that he approved of the Russian intervention in Syria, and perhaps would feel the same way about Libya, that he's ramping up the relationship with Russia in a number of ways. So I think he's going to move forward with that relationship, even if we provide all the aid.
Thank you. To follow up, Dr. Dunn, I was struck by your testimony where you point out that what under Sisi, Egypt is moving to a state where, even more so than under Mubarak, the interests of the few are what overrides decision-making as opposed to interest of the many. Remembering the press reports about the brief time in which the Islamic State controlled Egypt and there were a number of reports about mainstream Egyptian society. I'm probably using the wrong term there in terms of identifying who was concerned about that. But there were definitely reports that there were many Egyptians who were not happy with that situation and who were feeling relieved when Sisi actually took back control in Egypt. So to what extent do we think the Egyptian people are happy with what Sisi's doing and the direction that he's heading, and how do we speak to the people of Egypt in terms of the support that we want to provide?
Thank you, Senator. Look, I think that, it's certainly true that while Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was president of Egypt, it was a very brief time. It was a year. There were concerns among...
Thank you. Let me just correct. I think I said Islamic State. I meant the Muslim Brotherhood. So thank you for correcting me.
Thank you. There were concerns among more secular Egyptians who don't consider themselves Islamists that the Brotherhood would sort of try to bring about different expressions of Islamic law or things like that. There definitely were concerns. Now, the Brotherhood through Morsi was in power a very brief time, and frankly, they didn't have time to do any of that, and we can only kind of imagine what they would have done. What they did do, which Senator Graham indicated earlier, was to, overplay their hand, and they did a number of undemocratic things. They sort of manhandled the Egyptian judiciary and forced through a constitution that a lot of Egyptians didn't agree with, right? So it's true. There was a lot of public resentment and opposition to Morsi. But I think, unfortunately, what the military did was use that to not only remove Morsi, but to end the democratic transition. And that is, I don't think that is what most Egyptians wanted. People went out in the millions in June 2013 calling for a new presidential election. They wanted a chance to vote again on whether Morsi should continue his term or not. That's not what they got. They got an end to the whole thing and a restoration of military rule in a much more direct and brutal way than they had under Mubarak. Sisi is growing increasingly unpopular. There's not much polling in Egypt nowadays, but the little there is shows that because of his failure to deliver what he promised, either in terms of security or in terms of improving the economy, Egyptians are becoming disenchanted. But at this point, because he's thrown so many people in prison and eliminated so many opposition political forces, they really don't have many alternatives from which to choose.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, the recent visit by President Sisi saw the White House saying that they didn't want to make human rights an issue, a public issue. They preferred to work behind the scenes. President Trump suggested that. Is that a good approach for us to be taking when it comes to the human rights issues in Egypt?
You won't be shocked to hear me say no. And it's not just the impact on Egypt that I'm concerned about. I'm somewhat pessimistic about our ability to influence Egypt in any fundamental way right now. But when I was Assistant Secretary, I would often find in traveling around the world, in Africa and Asia, people would throw certain emblematic examples of American relationships with other countries in my face, and Egypt was one of them. Oh, you're here, you're criticizing us, you're urging us to do this and that. But look, in Egypt, you're propping up.
Right.
And I'd explain, okay, we're not, it's much more complicated, and we're criticizing them and withholding some aid. But the point is that when the whole world sees the spectacle of the Egyptian general coming to the White House and being praised in such a way by the President of the United States, and then the statement that we won't talk about human rights publicly, and I'm afraid it affects perceptions of what we stand for in the hearts and minds of people in every part of the world in a negative way. I'm glad they got Aya Hijazi out of prison, and I applaud President Trump for bringing her to the White House when she returned. That was a good symbolic action. But the way that visit itself was handled, I was very sad.
Me too. Thank you all.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Graham and Ranking Member Leahy, for convening the hearing and for our assembled witnesses for testifying today. I must say that this is a very disheartening hearing. It's a reminder just how challenging it is for us to pursue our three goals of promoting regional security, supporting American values, and defending human rights in a country that has received more than $70 billion in U.S. bilateral aid over many, many years. And many of the topics I had thought I would address have already been discussed by others. So let me focus on a few specific questions. Given the broad and intense crackdown on human rights that's been going on under the current government in Egypt, I'm concerned about it undermining long-term efforts to build any enduring political institutions or to successfully combat and defeat violent extremists. First, there's a significant amount, if I understand right, of unobligated economic support funds. I think something like $600 million. There were reports last year that these are funds that multiple organizations had received as implementing partners of ours, but never got final approval from the Egyptian government to continue their work. Why is Egypt delaying these funds? And why should we continue to provide funds when there's such a dramatic backlog? $600 million ain't chicken feed. That's real money and could make a significant difference in a country that has so many basic challenges addressing the real human needs of its people. I'm looking for any volunteer from the panel who wants to address that one.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, unfortunately, there is a long history of real problems between the United States government and the Egyptian government in getting the economic support funds spent in a productive way. One thing, there have been disagreements sometimes about economic reforms that were needed. There's been Egyptian government resistance. But then, puzzlingly, even when sometimes there was agreement on steps to be taken, there was even, specific programs agreed upon and signed and so forth with Egyptian ministries, there are times when the Egyptian government then has obstructed the implementation of programs. I believe Tom Malinowski was referring to just such a program of educational assistance that was to have been implemented by RTI. And so I think what this gets down to is a couple of things. One thing is that there is a deep xenophobia inside the Egyptian government, particularly certain parts of the Egyptian government, the security establishment, and they fight very hard against engagement between, people-to-people engagement between Egyptians and foreign organizations, non-governmental organizations and so forth, and they will try to block it because of their deep suspicion. The other thing is that basically there are parts of the Egyptian government, they really want the aid in cash, and sometimes they will just try to stonewall programs in the hopes that it will eventually just be delivered in cash, as cash budget support with few or no conditions. So there is a long history of this, and if you would permit me, Senator, my own feeling about this is this could usefully be converted into something like, for example, a fund for scholarships, for university and vocational educational scholarships for Egyptians, for the kind of training that they need that perhaps could be implemented with a minimum of Egyptian government involvement.
Interesting. Mr. Malinowski.
Yeah. So a while back, President Sisi made a speech in which he mentioned a concept known as, that he referred to as fourth generation warfare. And what he meant by that, as other Egyptian officials explained in more detail, was an effort by the United States and other Western countries to destroy Egypt from within. I'm using their terms, by through these kinds of assistance programs, subverting Egyptian youth, spreading Western ideals, democratic ideals, human rights ideals, etc. We had a talk with him about that during the former administration, and about the broader problem of this anti-American propaganda. And we didn't hear as much of that personally from him subsequently, but certainly in the Egyptian state media, pro-government media, these kinds of attacks on our aid providers, including RTI, continued to the point where it became very, very difficult for them to continue to do their work. They worried about their safety of their Egyptian employees, amongst other things. I totally agree that something like a scholarship program would be a great way to spend economic assistance money in Egypt. It would be the thing, probably above all, that ordinary Egyptians would appreciate. I'm not sure if we could implement it, because you can't just do it remotely. You've got to have people there to do the selection and figure out, who gets what, and I don't know if we could do that without risk.
I've just a minute and a half left, so two other questions, and Mr. Abrams, I'll invite you to answer all of these in one move, if you could. Some have called upon the Trump administration to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and I'd be interested, Ms. Dunn, if there's sufficient evidence to do so, and what would the consequences be? And then last, Mr. Abrams, you might combine a comment on ESF with whether long-term stability in Egypt is possible without strengthening civil society. And I'd be interested in hearing what concerns you have about the attack on civil society. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to start by saying on the international cooperation question, part of the problem is the so-called Ministry of International Cooperation in Cairo, which is about the least cooperative agency on the face of the earth when it comes to implementing American aid programs. I will leave the MB answer to others, but no, you should not designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. That would be, I think, a very foolish move. Egypt is not going to be stable if there is nothing in it but the army and the opposition to the army. Right. And if all of the civil society organizations that represent actually not just Egyptians, but represent American values, as it turns out, in Egypt, like freedom of press and freedom of speech, freedom of association, free trade unions, are crushed by the state. That's going to weaken stability in Egypt, not only in the long run, but I'd say in the medium run.
Thank you. Ms. Dunn.
Briefly on the Muslim Brotherhood question, Senator. First of all, no, I don't believe the evidence exists. First of all, there isn't anything really globally called the Muslim Brotherhood, but even let's just look at the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood itself. I don't think the evidence exists that they are carrying out actions that meet the U.S. legal standard of terrorist activity. Second of all, I would say that I think if the United States decided to designate regardless, even without the evidence, it would be handing a major victory to ISIS, because they are the ones who have argued that, only violence works, and therefore that those Islamists who tried to pursue change through political or other means were fools.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the whole panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for coming today. Foreign assistance can serve as an effective tool of American foreign policy and advance U.S. interests abroad, whether it be humanitarian aid or economic and military support. That being said, it's essential the programs are administered in an open, transparent, and accountable fashion that minimizes the potential of unintended consequences or use by inappropriate recipients. The significance of accountability was further highlighted by the recent horrific terrorist attacks on Coptic Christians and others in Egypt. Ensuring that U.S. taxpayer dollars and equipment does not end up in the wrong hands is certainly of utmost importance. Dr. Dunn, in terms of Egyptian political stability, what do you see as the potential best and worst case scenarios for the next 2 to 3 years?
Thank you, Senator. Look, the best case scenario would be that some sort of a return to a more open political process in which more people can participate, a turn away from repression and human rights abuses, a change in the economic policies towards something that's a little more private sector oriented and oriented toward generating jobs for ordinary Egyptians. I wish I thought that was a likely scenario, but I haven't seen any indications that things are going that way. The worst case scenario, there is a possibility of sort of political unrest similar to what happened in 2011. What's even worse than that, though, would be if the insurgency that is based in Sinai and the individual cells related to ISIS that we see starting to pop up in the Egyptian mainland were to really take off, into a kind of a larger insurgency. And that's my fear about the Egyptian government's approach right now, that they are actually driving toward this insurgency becoming a much larger thing and really destabilizing the country.
Thank you. So when you think about the U.S. relationship with Egypt, and particularly the continued U.S. support for President Sisi, what are the potential benefits as well as the risks ahead of the next Egyptian presidential election?
Yes, Senator, as you point out, so President Sisi's term ends about a year from now in May of 2018. And I do think the United States has to be careful about the signal that we send, that we should be supporting Egypt as a nation, the Egyptians as a people, and making a vote for a positive future for Egypt without endorsing necessarily President Sisi himself or the specific policies that he's pursuing, because many of them are quite troubling.
Mr. Abrams, in your testimony, you state that the Egyptian military remains a force designed to conduct conventional war, not to fight terrorism. With that in mind, the previous administration proposed to require military assistance to Egypt to be directed to be used for, and I will quote, counterterrorism, border security, Sinai security, and maritime security. Are these appropriate and effective conditions?
I think it's the right idea. I think The problem in part is that that may be what we direct our aid to, but if the Egyptian military is meanwhile buying, submarines, which they do not need to combat terrorism, buying high-performance combat jets, which they do not need to combat terrorism, they're wasting an awful lot of the resources. So we're pouring it in, but they're pouring it out on the wrong end. But I think what the Obama administration did in trying to push them in that direction is the right thing to do, and I would hope that the Congress would continue it.
So along that line, then, what other conditions might you recommend to ensure that U.S. assistance is used effectively and does advance our interests?
First, that we continue to insist that it be used on a certain kind of program, a certain kind of weapon system. I also think they need more training to do this in a way that suggests that they are killing terrorists rather than civilians. And the Egyptian military has said, it's in the testimony, they've killed about 2,500 ISIS people in Sinai and captured 2,500. That's 5,000. But the CIA estimates they're only between 500 and 1,000 anyway. So these numbers are not reliable. And I think we ought to have some conversations with the Egyptian military in which they are more honest with us about what they're doing, and in which they are not creating jihadis by attacking civilians in Sinai, creating sympathy for the Sinai province of ISIS.
So many of us were back home the last couple of weeks, and if you talk to the man or woman on the street, and if they were here on this dais and were asked the question, are U.S. interests, are they served by sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to Egypt, and why should America care? I'll let Mr. Abrams answer that. How would you respond to that in talking to the person on the street? As oftentimes we're having to justify, when we go back home, the significant amount of dollars that are sent overseas.
The latter part, I think we can say, is in a sense easier. We have learned the hard way that terrorism that emerges in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. So we are talking here about terrorist groups, the strength or weakness of terrorist groups that seek ultimately to attack the United States. Now, whether $1.3 billion for Egypt, looking at the global question of combating terrorism, whether $1.3 billion for Egypt can really be defended today, I think is a lot harder to explain to your constituents.
Dr. Dunn, Egypt's economy has grown in recent decades. You pointed that out. It still faces challenges in private sector growth, unemployment, especially for young people, Egyptians under the age of 30. How would you recommend the United States help boost Egypt's economy? And do you see opportunities in the ag and potentially natural resource sectors?
Thank you, Senator. So I've already mentioned that I do think the United States should support human development, the development of the Egyptian labor force, so young Egyptians coming into the market have good skills through our education, which is highly valued. On the job creation side, we really have this problem with Egyptian government policies not supporting not changing their policies in such a way as to support the private sector, small and medium enterprises. Could be the agricultural sector is one of the promising sectors in Egypt. So what we can do, I think we've been trying to do some things through the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. The United States, has established this fund, and I think it's starting to do some things that set a good example of how one would encourage small and medium enterprises and so forth. But admittedly, this is a very, very tough one. And several administrations have tried and not been successful in getting the Egyptian government to change its policies in such a way as to really generate jobs. It's a very tough one. What we can do is try to set a good example and do the best thing we can, do a little bit of good with the amount of aid that we're comfortable providing.
Thanks, Dr. Dunn. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. And Dr. Dunn, I think you're right on the mark when you said there's absolutely no way the Egyptian people bargain for the kind of repressive regime that they have today, 60,000 political prisoners, journalists being locked up. That's not what the Egyptian people asked for. I can also sense all of us are obviously frustrated because we are struggling with how we can better use our leverage and influence with Egypt, which over a period of time has been a close ally of the United States. And I think you all made the case very well that the United States is less reliant on Egypt sort of standing in the region. I think it's also fair to say from Egypt's perspective, they're a little less reliant on the United States given the amount of money they're getting from the Gulf states and some other potential limits. That's not to say we don't have leverage. So this committee is going to have to make specific decisions on where we go on military assistance and the economic assistance. Thank you, Dr. Dunn, for your suggestions with respect to the economic assistance. I'd like to get from all of you where you stand on the following things. Should Congress put in a restriction that continues the Obama administration's prohibition on the cash flow financing? Should we put that in the legislation? Yes. All three, yes. Okay. Now, Senator Daines raised the question about limiting the military assistance to the 4 pillars that the Obama administration had laid out: counterterrorism, border security, Sinai security, maritime security. Mr. Abrams, you pointed out that there's a lot of flexibility in those categories. Based on your testimony, it sounds to me like you all might support actually a tightening of those categories and making it even more focused on counterterrorism, Sinai, maybe some strict border security type actions. Is that the case?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, and I would add access to the Sinai for our people. I would add for journalists. NGOs would be an important piece of this. I mean, if we're going to be serious about counterinsurgency, there's got to be accountability that goes with that. And one of the outrageous demands that we made, quote unquote, outrageous demands we made on the Egyptians was, if we're going to be giving you all of this help in the Sinai, maybe you should allow our people to go there and see what's going on. And that was not received with great enthusiasm.
I hear you. Dr. Dunn.
Yes, I mean, and look, the GAO report from a year ago spoke about the very serious problems the United States has had with end-use monitoring and human rights vetting that are, required by our laws based on obstruction by the Egyptian government. So I think we need to take another look at that and be serious about that, especially in view of these very troubling recent reports about extrajudicial killings.
Got it. And would you all support a continuation of the 15% withholding unless there's a certification that the Egyptian government is making progress toward more democracy and human rights?
Actually, I'd raise it because the last year has been really horrendous for human rights. Mm-hmm. So I would at least ask you to consider going to 20 or 25.
Okay.
I would agree with that, and I think also that at a more basic level, as long as we continue to keep the $1.3 billion in FMF on sort of autopilot, and they know that's going to be approved every year, and then it's just a question of how do we do it, that's another thing that sort of removes some U.S. leverage. I think it's time for a sort of ground-up assessment of what is really needed to help Egypt effectively and in a way that we think we can monitor and respect our own laws and so forth in doing.
I strongly agree with Dr. Dunn. Keeping the 15% is better than nothing, but I think a much more fundamental assessment is needed. The basic problem is that Egypt does not view this assistance as having a policy purpose. This is not money that America is giving us to help us achieve something. It is owed. It is part of a deal that was struck decades ago. And that mentality, I think, is what I could not explain to your constituents and that needs to be broken.
Fair enough. So provision extending the ban on the cash flow financing, conditions that limit the aid that we do provide, the military assistance that we do provide to even narrower category, and then expanding the amount withheld or reducing the overall amount based on the current conditions? Would you look in terms of the current conditions for withholding? Do you have any suggestions there? Do you think that the criteria are the right ones?
I think I would need to look at them again in light of what's happening on the ground right now. I mean, I think they're the right categories, but we always want to try to hone them to the daily realities.
Okay. And my last question is, assuming the Senate accepts these recommendations and we move forward with these conditions, obviously the Egyptian government won't like it, but what do you believe their reaction will be? Do you think that they will move forward with us? Using this leverage in the way we're talking about, I assume your judgment is that this would be a sort of a moment where we say to the Egyptians, this is not on automatic pilot. We are serious about this, and you believe that that will have in the long term, a beneficial result.
I don't think the Egyptians are going to walk away. The aid is still very significant, and it's very significant for the military, which is the President Sisi's base of support. And you know what will happen if you cut the aid, you meaning the Congress, is that the administration will play good cop, bad cop in what is potentially a very useful way.
And I would add to that, Senator, that clearly President Sisi is eager to have a good relationship with President Trump. He has sort of sought that avidly from the time of the campaign until now. And so, you know, and the administration has indicated that they're going to have a fresh look at aid. I was struck by the fact that during President Sisi's visit, he did not get a promise, it seems, from the administration to keep aid on autopilot. So there's a moment here, I think, that can be used to redefine the relationship in a way that's more in our interests.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you all for a very, very helpful hearing as we try to go forward. We're about to do, hopefully this week, FY17, but we'll take all this in terms of FY18. It's going to be a real budget struggle. We've got to find a way to replace these sequestration caps. 29% cut to the State Department is just unacceptable. But the reason we have this hearing is that we all care. I care about Egypt. I want to have a good relationship with Egypt. What I see is disheartening. I'm not asking Egypt to do what I'm telling them. I'm asking Egypt to listen to their people who went out in the streets in 2011. And to me, this is not what they bargained for. I don't think they got what they bargained for from Mr. Morsi. And I don't think they're getting what they're bargained for or hoped for from the current regime, the current administration. And as to the taxpayer dollars we have, I think we're obligated to spend them wisely, consistent with our values. As to what Egypt might do, I don't know what they might do. I just know what we need to do. We need to reshape the relationship in a way that's sustainable. A good outcome for Egypt is a good outcome for us. And what's a good outcome? That everybody's sharing the benefits of the economy, that the military is a strong institution, but it's not the most dominant player in the economy, and that political parties can form and people can have their voices heard without fear. These are simple things that we take for granted but have stood the test of time, and that's not the direction we're headed. As to what they might do with Russia or any other country, I just hope they understand that we want to be friendly, but I don't think it's wise to hook your wagon to Putin. I don't think he's long for this world. I think what he offers Russia over time will be rejected. It's just a matter of time before the Russian people realize that Putin's played them for a fool, ripped them off, put their country and their economy at risk. And I hope Egypt will take a new direction, not march toward Putin, but march away from him. March back to the square where it all started. With that, the hearing is adjourned. We'll have a next hearing on May 9th on democracy programs and sometimes later about the FY 2018 budget. Thank you all for coming. The hearing's adjourned.